For 5 long years, the loyal black stallion stood vigil at the edge of the meadow, waiting for a master who would never return. Until one stormy night, with a wild cry, he broke free and vanished into the forest. What happens next will leave you speechless. The wind drifted softly across the golden plains of Montana, carrying the faint echoes of a small town's quiet endurance. On the outskirts of Willow Creek stood an old wrought-iron gate, its paint weathered and peeling from years under the relentless sun and snow. It marked the boundary of Caldwell Ranch, home to a creature as enduring as the land itself, a majestic black stallion named Shadow. His sleek coat shimmered under the early light of dawn, and his deep, penetrating eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if yearning for something or someone. Shadow had once been the prized companion of Captain Nathan Caldwell, a hero in the hearts of the townsfolk who had ridden him off to war 5 years ago. When Nathan departed, he left Shadow in the care of Lila Monroe, a young woman who had grown up working on the ranch. Over time, she and Shadow had forged an unspoken understanding, though Lila knew their bond could never rival the deep connection the stallion shared with his master. Each evening, Shadow would prowl the edge of the meadow before stopping at the gate, standing utterly still, ears alert, as though he were waiting for the sound of galloping hooves returning him home. The townspeople had grown accustomed to the sight. Some found it heartbreakingly loyal, a symbol of devotion that transcended time. Others, their words laced with cynicism over beers at the local bar, deemed it a fruitless hope. After all, no one came back from war unchanged, if they came back at all. But Lila held fast to her belief. She would sit by the gate with Shadow as the sun melted into the hills, her voice steady as she read aloud from the letters Nathan had sent from the front. But now, months had passed since the last letter arrived, and the quiet absence gnawed at her resolve, though she never let it show. One evening, under the heavy weight of an approaching rainstorm, Lila stood in the stable, running a soft brush along Shadow's mane. The stallion remained calm under her gentle touch, though his ears twitched sharply toward the meadow, always on alert. "Still waiting, aren't you?" Lila murmured, her voice low and tinged with sadness. "Me too." The words hovered in the air, a fragile thread of connection between the two of them. Later that night, as Lila prepared to lock the stable doors, a piercing whinny shattered the stillness, sending shivers down her spine. She rushed out to find Shadow at the gate, his powerful hooves clawing at the ground in a frenzy. His head flung high, nostrils flared, he neighed into the darkness with a desperation that made Lila's heart race. "Shadow, what is it?" she called, her voice trembling. The horse turned toward her, his eyes wide with urgency, before snapping his gaze back to the horizon. He pawed at the ground, his muscled frame trembling with energy as if the very air had shifted, thick with something Lila couldn't name. The faint tolling of the town's church bell echoed in the distance, a somber reminder of the storm's imminent arrival. Wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders, Lila scanned the darkening sky. Yet it wasn't the weather that unnerved her. It was the palpable, undeniable sense that something had irrevocably changed. Just as she reached out to steady Shadow, a jagged streak of lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating the land beyond the gate. For the briefest of moments, Lila thought she saw movement, a shadow too deliberate to be the wind. She blinked, and it was gone. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing storm. Shadow let out another urgent cry, his hooves pounding the earth with renewed force. The rain began to fall in earnest, soaking Lila as she stood rooted in place, her unease growing with each passing second. Whatever Shadow sensed, it wasn't over. Not yet. The rain battered the roof of the stable relentlessly throughout the night, its rhythm a haunting backdrop to Lila's restless thoughts. She sat with her back against the stable wall, watching Shadow pace with a nervous energy she'd never seen before. His gaze stayed fixed on the stable doors, as if anticipating them to burst open at any moment. Not even the fiercest tempests had ever unsettled him this way. By the time dawn broke, the storm had eased, leaving the ranch shrouded in a ghostly mist. Hoping to ease his agitation, Lila led Shadow into the meadow for a walk. Yet his ears stayed perked, his dark eyes constantly darting toward the horizon. Unlike him, the other horses in the nearby paddocks were calm, grazing contentedly, oblivious to the tension that gripped Shadow. "Lila!" a voice called, breaking her thoughts. Turning, she saw Ryan, the blacksmith's apprentice, striding toward her. His cheeks were flushed from the morning chill, and a look of concern clouded his usually easy-going demeanor. There was talk at the tavern last night. News from the front. Some soldiers were returning. Lila's heart surged with hope. "Did they mention Captain Caldwell?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ryan's face turned cautious as he shook his head. No word about him specifically, but they're saying the survivors are in rough shape. The words hit Lila like a weight in her chest. For 5 long years, she had clung to hope, buoyed by Nathan's letters filled with promises of a future together. Yet, as the months of silence dragged on, doubts began to creep into her thoughts. She never dared to voice them, least of all around Shadow. Somehow, she felt the horse could sense her fears as keenly as she could sense his moods. Later that afternoon, while Lila was cleaning the stable, her fingers brushed against something hidden in the hay. Brow furrowing, she pulled it free and gasped. A tarnished brass medal gleamed faintly in the light, and she instantly recognized Nathan's name engraved upon it. He had shown it to her once, a token of honor from a past campaign. "How did this end up here?" she murmured, holding it up as her voice wavered. Shadow shifted in his stall, his dark eyes tracking her movements. "Did you find this?" Lila asked, half laughing at the absurdity of speaking to a horse. But there was something in Shadow's gaze, almost knowing, that sent a shiver through her. She slid the medal into her pocket, unease prickling at her skin. If Shadow had uncovered it, where had it been all this time? And why had it surfaced now? The following days were restless ones. Shadow's behavior grew increasingly strange. He pawed at the ground by the gate, galloped in tight circles around the meadow, and turned away from his usual meals. Lila tried everything to calm him, but nothing seemed to work. Villagers began to whisper. "That horse is going mad," Mrs. Foster muttered during her morning walk. Others were less forgiving, murmuring that Shadow's agitation was a bad sign, a grim omen that Nathan wasn't coming back. Some suggested Lila sell him, claiming he was a burden, but the thought was unbearable. Shadow wasn't just a horse. He was a living piece of Nathan, a reminder of their bond. Selling him would feel like surrendering, and Lila wasn't ready to give up. One evening, as the sky turned crimson with the setting sun, Lila sat by the gate, clutching Nathan's medal in her hand. Its edges were worn smooth from her fingers as she traced them absently. "You miss him too, don't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the evening breeze. Shadow lowered his head, his warm breath brushing against her arm, and for a moment Lila swore he understood her. The next morning brought an unexpected arrival. A group of weary soldiers trudged into the village, their uniforms in tatters and their faces hollowed with exhaustion. Lila's heart thundered in her chest as she rushed toward them. Among the group, she spotted Sergeant Pierce, one of Nathan's closest comrades. "Sergeant," she called, clutching his arm with trembling hands. "Do you know anything about Nathan? Captain Caldwell?" Pierce's expression darkened, and he hesitated. "The last I saw of him—" His voice cracked. "It was chaos, Miss Whitaker. We were ambushed under heavy fire. The captain stayed behind to cover our retreat." Lila's knees weakened and the world seemed to shift. "Stayed behind?" she echoed. "What does that mean? Is he—" Her voice broke, and Pierce sighed, his words heavy with regret. "I don't know. All I can say is that he fought like hell to protect us. If anyone could survive, it's him." Lila returned to the stable, her thoughts racing. Shadow greeted her with a sharp, piercing neigh, his agitation fiercer than ever. She couldn't shake the feeling that the horse knew something, sensed something that she didn't. Could his unease be tied to Nathan? As if in answer, Shadow let out a powerful whinny and bolted toward the gate. His hooves churned the earth with a purpose Lila had never seen before. "Shadow!" she cried, sprinting after him, her pulse roaring in her ears. She clutched the metal tightly as she ran, the chill morning air burning her lungs and misting her breath. The fields were cloaked in fog, muffling her shouts. "Shadow, stop!" she called again, but the stallion's resolve was unshaken. His black coat shimmered in the dim light as he charged ahead, each stride carrying him closer to an unknown destination. Lila followed, fear and hope warring in her chest. Whatever lay beyond the gate, Shadow was determined to lead her there. He rode with a determined stride, his pace unyielding as though propelled by an unseen force. Lila felt her heart hammering in her chest, an inexplicable compulsion driving her forward, urging her to follow. She had no idea why, but something deep within her believed she was being guided toward a revelation. The open meadow soon surrendered to a dense forest, its skeletal branches clawing skyward through a thick veil of mist. The ground grew treacherous beneath her feet, tangled with roots and jagged stones, each step an effort against the soft, rain-soaked earth. It had been years since she'd ventured this far from the village. Ever since her father's death, had transformed the woods from a place of solace into one of emptiness and alienation. Shadow, her horse, came to a halt, his nostrils flaring as he surveyed the dim thicket. His ears twitched in agitation, and he snorted, stamping the ground as though aggrieved by some unseen presence. "What is it, boy?" Lila called out, breathless as she caught up to him. Shadow's head turned sharply toward a shadowy patch of undergrowth, his eyes locked with unwavering focus. Lila hesitated but stepped closer, drawn to where his attention rested. Kneeling beside an ancient oak with roots that twisted and coiled like a living labyrinth, she spotted it, a weathered leather pack, almost consumed by the forest floor. Its straps were tattered, the leather cracked and scarred by time. Her breath hitched as she tugged the bag free, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a journal, its pages swollen and warped by age and dampness. On its cover, the initials TW were etched, faded yet unmistakable. Tears stung her eyes as she flipped through the pages. The handwriting was achingly familiar. Nathan's. Her brother's entries were filled with sketches and fragments of thoughts, moments captured before he left for the war. One passage caught her breath. "Shadow isn't just my horse. He's my partner, my anchor in the chaos. I trust him more than I trust myself. If I don't make it back, I pray someone cares for him. He deserves more than a life spent waiting." Lila clutched the journal tighter, her heart heavy yet brimming with emotion. As she read further, the notes became more erratic, the handwriting uneven, desperation creeping into the lines. One of the final entries sent a chill through her. The fighting is worse than I imagined. If I survive, it will be because of Shadow. He saved me once, shielding me from shrapnel. If I don't return, I hope he finds his way home. He always knows the way. Shadow snorted loudly, his hoof pawing at the ground as though reminding her of his presence. Lila stood, the journal pressed tightly against her chest, her eyes meeting Shadow's. In that moment, an uncanny calm washed over her, as if the fear and confusion dissipated into a quiet understanding. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered, sensing his wisdom, his purpose. Somehow he had brought her here, not just to uncover Nathan's words, but to feel his presence once more. Shadow let out a sharp whinny, his body suddenly tense. Without hesitation, he began moving deeper into the forest, his steps certain, his purpose undeniable. Clutching the journal, Lila followed, her boots sinking into the mud as she stumbled forward. She caught herself against the rough bark of trees, her scraped hands stinging, but her resolve unwavering. The mist thickened, the chill seeping through her coat, but Shadow pressed on, his path sure and deliberate. The terrain grew familiar, though long-buried memories struggled to surface. They reached a narrow ravine that stirred faint recollections of a childhood hunting trip with her father. She had been here before, though the memories were vague. A stone marker, weathered but distinct, serving as a guide through the dense woods. As clarity broke through the fog of her mind, she realized the path Shadow had chosen mirrored that long-ago journey. Shadow stopped abruptly at the base of the ravine, his intense gaze fixed on a cluster of ancient trees. Lila's pulse quickened as she approached, a knot of anticipation tightening in her chest. Beneath the twisted roots of a towering oak, something lay hidden, a shape partially concealed by leaves and earth. Dropping to her knees, her breath caught in her throat as she brushed away the dirt, her heart racing with the weight of discovery. He was a man, his uniform in tatters, his face obscured by grime, trembling uncontrollably. Lila's fingers brushed away the layers of dirt, uncovering Nathan's face beneath. His skin was pallid, his eyes shut, but there was no mistaking him. "Nathan!" she cried, her voice breaking with a mix of fear and relief. At the sound of her call, his eyes flickered open, locking onto hers for one agonizing moment before his strength faltered. "Shadow found me," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Lila choked back a sob, pulling him tightly into her embrace. Shadow, her steadfast stallion, stood close, his warm breath misting around them like a protective shield against the cold, unyielding rain. It was as though he'd been sent to guide her beyond the familiar edges of their village, into the shadowy wilderness, to this very spot where Nathan lay waiting. Shadow nickered softly, his ears flicking in a way that seemed to say, "I always know the way." Lila's heart thundered in her chest as she clutched Nathan tightly, her hands trembling as they worked to clear away the mud and rain streaking his face. All around them, the clearing was shrouded in an oppressive darkness. The wind shrieked through the trees and heavy sheets of rain beat down on the earth, intensifying the dire urgency she felt. Nathan's skin was cold and pale, his breaths shallow, but he was alive. Shadow's imposing frame loomed over them, shielding them from the relentless storm. The stallion's eyes glowed with an unearthly intensity as they met Lila's, as though urging her to act swiftly. "Stay with me, Nathan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she fought to steady herself. "You're going to make it. I won't let you go." The clearing felt impossibly far from any semblance of safety, the forest a maze of twisted branches that blocked the scant light, the rain-soaked ground slick and treacherous beneath her feet. Her allies, exhausted soldiers left behind in the village, were miles away. She was alone, save for Shadow. Summoning all her courage, Lila tore a strip from her skirt, wrapping it tightly around Nathan's wounds in a desperate attempt to staunch the bleeding. Fear clawed at her insides, but she forced herself to focus, clinging to the hope that these frantic actions might keep him alive. Nathan winced under her touch, his eyes fluttering open briefly before sliding shut again. Her chest tightened with desperation. "You'll be all right," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Suddenly, Shadow neighed sharply, stamping his hooves with an urgency that cut through the chaos around them. Lila looked up at him, feeling his unspoken command as he turned his gaze toward the forest path. His stance was tense, deliberate, and his eyes were filled with a resolve that mirrored the one Nathan had often shown during his strongest moments. She understood. With a steadying breath, Lila nodded. "All right, boy, we'll do this together." Summoning every ounce of strength, she heaved Nathan's limp form, his weight a crushing burden against her smaller frame. Shadow held steady, his head low, allowing her to drape Nathan across his broad back. The stallion remained unflinching, acutely aware of the precious life he carried. Gripping the reins tightly, Lila began leading them back through the forest. The rain persisted, turning the already treacherous path into a mud-slicked trial. Lila stumbled repeatedly, her knees scraping against the cold, wet ground, but each time she rose, more determined than before. Shadow moved with cautious precision, his steps deliberate to keep Nathan balanced. Each agonizing step forward felt like a victory, a fragile thread of hope keeping Lila going. As the first light of dawn broke through the storm, the village came into view, its warm lights flickering like a beacon of salvation. "Help! Please! Someone help!" Lila cried, her voice raw and desperate. The sound carried over the still-waking settlement, and figures began to emerge from the shadows. Ryan and Sergeant Pierce were the first to reach her. The sergeant's face twisted in shock as his eyes fell upon Nathan, barely conscious and draped across Shadow's back. "It can't be," he whispered, disbelief flashing in his expression before resolve hardened his features. "We need to get him inside now." Working quickly, they lifted Nathan from Shadow's back and carried him into the warmth of the village tavern. The room filled with villagers, their faces a mixture of astonishment and worry as they gathered around to see the captain they had long thought lost. Blankets and warm water arrived almost immediately, followed by the healer. Lila lingered by the doorway, drenched and shivering, her eyes glued to the scene as they worked desperately to stabilize Nathan. Outside, Shadow stood in the rain, his head bowed low, but his gaze fixed unwaveringly on the door. Lila, unable to stay still, stepped back into the downpour, her hand gently resting on the stallion's neck. "You saved him," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "You truly saved him." Shadow responded with a soft whinny, pressing into her touch as if to say, "It was what I was meant to do." As the days passed, Nathan's condition steadily improved. The healer called it nothing short of a miracle, recounting how they had tirelessly cleaned his wounds, applied medicinal herbs to stave off infection, and kept his body warm against the biting cold. But Lila knew, deep in her heart, that it was Shadow's relentless determination that had brought Nathan back from the brink. When Nathan was finally strong enough to sit up and speak, he asked for Lila. She entered the room hesitantly, her chest tight with emotion at the sight of him upright, his eyes gleaming with recognition. "You found me," he rasped, his voice faint but steady. "No," Lila replied, her smile trembling through her tears. "Shadow found you. He never gave up." Nathan's expression softened and unshed tears shimmered in his eyes. "He's always been the brave one," he murmured, "even when I couldn't be." Word of Shadow's loyalty spread quickly through the small countryside town. Villagers who had once dismissed the stallion as nothing special now marveled at his courage and devotion. Children came in groups to the pasture to catch a glimpse of the horse who had braved the elements to save his master. Shadow's tale grew, his name becoming synonymous not only with his service as a war horse, but as a symbol of steadfast loyalty and unwavering love. One brisk morning, as frost still clung to the grass, Nathan, now leaning on a cane, made his way to the meadow where Shadow grazed. Lila watched quietly from the stable as he approached, his steps deliberate but sure. Shadow lifted his head at the sound of Nathan's approach, his ears twitching in recognition. "Hello, old friend," Nathan greeted warmly, his voice imbued with gratitude. He placed a hand on Shadow's neck, and the horse closed his eyes as if savoring the touch. For a moment there was no war, no pain, no grief, just a man and his horse, together again. As the seasons changed and wildflowers blanketed the meadow, Lila often found herself recalling that fateful stormy night. It felt like a distant dream, yet its reality was undeniable every time she saw Nathan and Shadow together. Both were healing, the bond between them growing deeper with each passing day. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in hues of amber and gold, Lila stood by the fence, watching Nathan ride Shadow across the meadow. Their silhouettes blended with the fading sunlight, a perfect portrait of harmony. They waited for each other, Lila whispered to herself, her heart swelling with quiet joy. And they found their way back. As if sensing her thoughts, Shadow lifted his head, his mane catching the evening breeze. He let out a triumphant, resonant neigh that echoed across the hills, a declaration of victory, loyalty, and an unshakable love. And for Lila, it was proof enough to believe in miracles. Wow, what a ride this story has been. It's more than just a tale about a horse and his master. It's a profound exploration of loyalty, love, and the unbreakable bonds that hold us together. Shadow's unwavering dedication to Nathan reminds us that hope can guide us through even the darkest storms, just as it did for Lila when she chose to follow him into the unknown. What struck me most was how the story weaves together resilience and trust. Shadow isn't just a horse. He's a symbol of enduring faith, a reminder that sometimes the ones we lean on are stronger than we ever imagined. And Lila? Her courage and determination to uncover the truth, no matter the cost, teach us that love isn't passive. It's an action, a choice we make every day. I think the most beautiful part of this story is how it reflects the connections we share with those we care about, whether human or animal. Shadow and Nathan had a bond forged in trust and survival, and Lila became the bridge that kept that connection alive. Together, they prove that even in loss and uncertainty, there's room for miracles and second chances. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment from the story resonated with you the most? Did it make you reflect on the relationships in your life, or the times you've had to trust in something bigger than yourself? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to keep this conversation going. And hey, if you believe in the kind of loyalty and love that Shadow represents, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, take care and keep believing in your own miracles.